2005, 2020. Two seemingly innocuous years, right? Wrong. These years actually mark the birth and rebirth of the Avatar: The Last Airbender fandom. And this is the chilling tale of two fandoms in two different eras of the internet. Initially airing in February 2005 on Nickelodeon, Avatar: The Last Airbender, or ATLA for short, got very popular very quickly. By the time of season 2's finale, the show was averaging 1.1 million views per episode, with season 3 famously beating out SpongeBob SquarePants' multi-year run at the Kids' Choice Awards in 2008. Everyone wanted to be an earthbender or an airbender or a waterbender. Firebenders, I'm sure, had their audience, with many of those viewers also wanting to create fan fiction or fan works or just generally talk about the show with other fans. The show had a crazy big fandom pretty much from the jump, and although it decreased in size over the years to follow after the show's initial run, it still remained pretty active for the years to come. Until that fateful day in 2020. A lot of things happened in 2020, but most relevantly, Avatar: The Last Airbender returned to Netflix. Although the show had been on Netflix until 2017, this 2020 reintroduction came at the perfect time for everyone to sit at home and rewatch as much TV as possible. And as more and more people started to rewatch it, more and more people started to remember that this show is actually pretty good. And so in 2020, the ATLA Fandom 2.0 was born. In the 15 years between both of ATLA's big fandom booms, the internet and fandom culture had changed a lot. The initial fandom that had been around for the internet equivalent of centuries, no offense, was now getting met with tens if not hundreds of thousands of new fans who were coming up with new headcanons and ships and just generally ways for the media to be reinterpreted and re-expressed through the fandom. What I find really interesting is this comparison between the old and the new fandom and what changes in fandom culture and attitude we can learn by looking at them side by side. When I was initially exploring the older fandom on LiveJournal, I found this very convenient guide to the fandom by user Dharmavati. The guide itself is slightly dated, but importantly, it features links to a lot of the other LiveJournal communities within the larger fandom. There were general fan communities, shipping communities, meta communities, capsule communities, which is such a product of its time and I love it so much. In the guide's overview, Dharmavati mentions that ATLA attracts a vastly diverse audience and that it's really cool to see people of different interests fan geeking about the show. The fact that it exists as such a distinct individual world and features such amazingly written characters means that it appeals to a huge range of people and then brings those people together. Whether you like the politics stuff, the relationships, or just the cool superpowers and weapons, I think it was a really well-rounded show. As a result, although the forums like the ones on LiveJournal did categorize and separate these interests, that's all they really were, categories. Every fan who navigated them would have been exposed to and found it easy to access the other ones. Which I think in a way is a system that encouraged active discussion within all areas of the fandom in the way that we don't really see in contemporary fandoms. I didn't grow up with LiveJournal, but looking at it from an outsider's perspective, it's a really interesting example of the organisation of early fandoms. Fan communities on the internet initially existed as dedicated fan forums or fan sites, before eventually morphing into the all-in-one place kind of social media design that we have today. So it's really interesting to me to see this kind of earlier internet fandom day setup in action. As well as on sites like LiveJournal, a lot of ATLA discussions and fan works were circulated on devoted fan sites. One of the more prominent ones, and my personal favourite, was the fan site Distant Horizon, run by a user called Jade, who I think also goes by Musogato. The site featured links to games, discussions, fan art, and it even had one of those which character are you quizzes where it's really obvious which answer links to which character, but I still did it anyway and I got Aang. So expect me to be bold in the next video update. As a side note, I really miss these fandom character quizzes. I'm sure there are still tons of people out there making them, but I feel like they're not as widespread as they used to be, and I just think collectively we should all start bringing them back because I like doing them and I'm nosy and I like to see what other people get. Anyway, most interestingly to me was that Jade also ran an annual pumpkin carving contest, which went on for 14 years and featured beautiful entries like this absolutely terrifying screaming soccer. I think this pumpkin carving contest was such a sweet tradition idea, and I know these kind of events do exist in contemporary fandoms, but I think they're more generally confined to specific discords and group chats and not just available for anyone to join in if they wanted to. Fan sites as a whole generally. Okay, I don't want this whole video to become about fan sites, but I love them so much because they're such an interesting artifact of each individual fandom. Jade also explains why they like ATLA in the first place, citing the music, plot, characters as some of the main draws to the show. They also defend the show as something that is enjoyed outside of its target audience of children, which is a sentiment that I saw echoed a lot across these earlier fan forums, this kind of idea of needing to justify watching a children's show. Because of the normalization of media fans generally over the years, I think watching a children's show isn't really something that's looked down upon or judged as much anymore, but I could also just be saying that because it's never occurred to me personally to be embarrassed about watching them. Anyway, because of this, I think the later fandom was able to adopt a more critical view of the show, because a lot of the earlier discussions in the original fandom were centered around justifying why this show was okay for grown-ups to watch and why it actually had adult themes and things, and it wasn't just one of those stupid cheesy kids shows. A really interesting example of this is actually the fandom's shift in attitude towards the main character Aang, which I'll talk more about later. But for now, the Tumblr 2020 Year in Review report claims that Avatar: The Last Airbender dominated the weekly fandometrics chart from May 18th to November the 2nd and was the overall 9th most popular tag that year. I don't think the fandom's revival ever quite reached the heights it did during the original show's run, but everyone was talking about it both offline and online, and so many people were invested that I think it at least emulated the initial buzz. One of the driving factors for the massive size of the ATLA Fandom 2.0 was the shift in the digital landscape towards social media platforms like Tumblr and Twitter, which are image-based and often host large numbers of fan communities already. As people started rediscovering ATLA and producing their own original fanworks and discussions, more and more people would see this content and then be influenced to watch and share themselves, and then make their own artworks and discussions, perpetuating this cycle further. I mentioned this earlier, but the pandemic was not only a massive catalyst for this widespread interest, but it also changed our relationship to fandoms and the internet generally. Everyone was online 24/7, posting constantly, being exposed to other people's posts and thoughts, missing the outside world. There were countless discords for 24/7 chatting, hundreds of posts and artworks every single day to keep up with, and a general shift in fandom attitude towards favouring character-driven or post-show content. A lot of the fandom original content centred around what the characters got up to after the events of the show. I think this is primarily due to 3 reasons. 1, Zukka joins the gang very late in the show, so it gave people an opportunity to explore the dynamics within the group beyond what they'd seen in the canon. Along these lines, a lot of people were also creating Zuko joins the gang early AUs. Number 2, it had been so many years since ATLA finished that people were moving away from discussions about what happened in the show as it was running and into the more headcanon-y areas of interest. Number 3, a lot of people that were rejoining or joining the fandom generally were older than the characters and just felt more comfortable talking about them if they were grown-ups too. I know there's supposed to be a movie coming out in October that follows the gang as adults, which I wonder if it was somewhat influenced by this massive fandom interest in them being grown-ups. I mostly think this because I do think the original show and The Legend of Korra handle their lives post-show pretty well and wrap up the story arcs pretty well, so I'm kind of a bit skeptical about whether or not we need this movie. I do understand why people are excited for it though. I think maybe I'm just a bit too judgmental of anything that I think is a bit too pandery. But I know it is 2D animated and that's always great to see. Anyway, one of the biggest differences in the two fandoms, and the one that I think most accurately represents the change in fandom culture over the years, is the shift from Zutara to Zukka. In case you're wondering why I just made those noises, Zutara and Zukka are the ship names for Zuko and Katara, and Zuko and Sokka respectively. One of the most unexpected outcomes from this massive rise in popularity was the sudden interest in the second ship, Zukka. And this was so interesting because I think it reflects contemporary shifts in fandom culture so well. Zutara absolutely dominated the ATLA fandom for years and years and years. It had thousands of fan works surrounding it, the biggest list of communities dedicated to discussing it on LiveJournal, and maybe most famously, tons of essays and analyses of why they worked so well and were meant to be together in the original text. It was a very, very popular ship, so when the Fandom 2.0 came around and decided that Zukka was the best thing ever, a lot of people were shocked, to say the least. I checked out what seems to have been the only community dedicated to Zukka back in 2008, but there really weren't many entries, and a lot of the discussion-based posts were just kind of discussing how dead the community was. In contrast, Tumblr's annual ship popularity ranking in 2021 had it in 16th place. So why did everyone walk the plank on Zutara and board Zukka? I think the most obvious answer everyone is kind of thinking is the cultural shift towards male/relationships instead of het/ like Zukka and Zutara were. But I also think the general attitude towards the characters in ATLA is a huge reason for the change. Zukka and Sokka together meant that you consistently had this very desirable dynamic of the angstiest yet also kind of silliest character paired with the silliest but also very angsty character. As such, not only were a lot of the fanworks very light-hearted and goofy in a time where people really needed that, but they also provided a lot of opportunities to explore fan-favourite themes of angst and hurt comfort and all that kind of stuff that people love. I can actually speak firsthand about this because back then I was 16 and in the trenches making fan art like 3 times a week for this ship. And it was always the most goofiest, cheesy, like incorrect quotes kind of artworks that I remember would perform the best. In contrast, when you look at how people like to interpret Zutara, such as in this very convenient community poll posted by user Littlebrat in 2005, people tended to prefer a much more serious enemies to lovers, introspective star-crossed kind of relationship. I also think the lack of canon interactions between these two characters really helped, as there was more space for fanon interpretation of their relationship. We had the Boiling Rock episode, but that was post-redemption arc, and I don't think they really had as many interactions as the other Zuko Makes Friends episodes did. Apparently there were also ship wars going on during this time. I'm not gonna lie, I've been in like a million different fandoms over the years and I've never seen any kind of ship wars going on, so either I operate in very idyllic, everyone's happy kind of spheres, or they're just not as common as people make them out to be. I had to dig and also go on Twitter to find any negative discourse about shipping. But what I did find was really interesting because it was mostly people complaining about Zutara shippers reading too much into the original text and making mans out of molehills, which is kind of like any analysis. But I do think this is a really interesting thing to complain about because analysing original media text in extreme detail is kind of fandom culture. So I don't really get this take, I don't think it really makes much sense, but maybe now I'm fighting in the shipping discourse, so yay! Another big change in the two fandoms was this massive attitude shift people had towards Aang. Before going into this, I do want to clarify that I think most people liked Aang, but I saw so many posts circulating about how he's irresponsible and immature. Which he is, but people thought it was to an unforgivable degree. I actually have a theory that the bulk of this problem was in how people were ingesting the media. Putting it on Netflix looked official, and it meant that it was right next to all these grown-up, more mature shows. So people would develop this perception of ATLA being much more grown-up oriented than it actually was. When it was airing on Nickelodeon, on the other hand, it was next to all the other kids shows and it was so obviously for kids, and so the characters had more space to act like kids. I also think the contemporary super fast ingestion of media nowadays means that people don't really expect so much to be packed into a single episode because they're used to longer, more drawn out plot lines. And not having a gap of about a week between each episode means that people don't really sit down and analyse and understand what they just saw in the plot and the story, and therefore why the characters acted like they did as a consequence. One of the biggest changes between ATLA 1 and ATLA 2 is that fandoms nowadays often exist as flash-in-the-pan almost trends. Fast circulation provided by the normalization of social media means that people fairly quickly move on to the next thing, and they don't really stay in specific communities and keep posting for years and years like they might once have done. Which honestly, I don't think is an awful thing. I like seeing everyone come together and get so excited and create so much stuff, and I think it's great that this system lets people explore and discover different media so much. It's okay to not just stick to one thing and to move around and change. I do think there's an argument to be made that it means that we lose more personal, individual aspects of fandom, but those still exist for people that want them, and there's like a million Discord servers to prove that. Please share if you have first-hand experience of being in either of these fandoms, because I found it so interesting to look at the comparison between the two. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching this video. Please subscribe to see more. And if you recognize my fan art, let me know in the comments. I was so embarrassed to show it because I look back at it and I'm like, this is so bad. But at the same time, I'm kind of charmed by how bad it is. Like, it's so 16 years old. Yeah, so let me know and have a good day. Bye!